The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, this is Suzanne de Beaumont from Open Doors, and welcome to the Understanding Grief webinar. We have Carly Nichols from CareFirst Hospice here to do the webinar for us. And I'd like to just do a couple of housekeeping items first. On your taskbar, you should see a section called questions. If you have questions, feel free to type them at any time in the question box. And you also have a feature where you can raise your hand. So if you have a question and would prefer to ask it out loud instead of in typed form, then you can raise your hand and be unmuted. There will be a time at the end of the webinar where general questions can be asked, and you can type questions throughout the webinar. So the reason that we asked Carly to do this webinar for us was because with the pandemic, we have been experiencing a great deal of loss, and this is one of the things that we felt like would be helpful to folks out there. So without further ado, thank you, Carly, for being willing to do this for us, and it's a really timely topic.
Yeah, thank you, Suzanne. And I'm so appreciative to be here and to be able to offer support to everybody. I understand that there's probably people joining us from across the state, so I appreciate you taking the time to listen in today. And I hope that the webinar will, and the information that's provided will be able to help you better understand grief and loss, and be able to hopefully identify maybe some specific reactions that you're having related to grief or loss that you've been experiencing throughout this pandemic. And then finally at the end, be able to offer some specific ways and practical ways of coping. So I wanted to first just kind of give you a brief overview of who CareFirst is. So we are the Hospice, Palliative Care, and Grief Services Agency in the Southern Tier. We serve Steuben, Chemung, and Schuyler counties. And we offer those 3 core services. We also, under the grief services, have a service called the Clinic at CareFirst, and this is a collaborative project or a collaborative effort with a local mental health agency to be able to provide counseling services for folks who are experiencing loss and grief. We're a licensed mental health satellite clinic, so we technically have to provide services to anybody who is accessing them, regardless of the need. However, we're really specializing in grief and loss, traumatic loss, anticipatory loss, and then also any complicated health issues as well. So people who are experiencing chronic and or end of life issues can seek services through the Clinic at CareFirst, and we serve individuals, groups, families, kids, teens, a wide array of different folks. So just as kind of an overview of who we are. So what is grief? So grief really impacts us on all different levels. Grief is physical, it's emotional, it affects us cognitively, spiritually, and it's usually in response to either an actual or threatened loss of a person, a place, a thing, to which we are most emotionally attached to. And underneath, I included a quote by John Bowlby, who is really the father of attachment theory, and he said that we grieve because we are biologically willed to attach. So because of the attachments that we form in our lives, whether they're personal, whether they're professional, to people, places, things, those attachments are the reason why we grieve when we lose those things. So at CareFirst, we really take the approach when we're dealing with individuals who are coming and seeking services through us for their grief and their loss and their reactions because of that. Our approach really is that grief is normal and it's a natural response to loss. Everybody experiences that, and oftentimes for folks who are in my office and I'm meeting with them for counseling, one of the biggest things for them is to be able to just understand that this is a normal response, and that the things that they're feeling are very common and very typical when experiencing the loss of either a person or a thing. And grief really isn't a problem to be solved, but rather than a process to be experienced. So we kind of believe and we kind of hold true in our clinic and the folks that we work with that there's really no solution to grief. Unfortunately, I often tell my clients, I wish I had a magic wand that I could wave and be able to make all of that better. And I'm sure a lot of other people in their lives feel the same way, but unfortunately, it's not that simple. So it is a process to really be experienced and a journey to go through. One of the biggest things too is that there's really no timetable for grief. So a lot of people feel this immense pressure to grieve in a certain way or to grieve in a linear fashion. And as we'll talk about later, that's really not the case. As researchers in the grief and loss field have investigated over the years, they're really, it's more so cyclical, and it is something that is not so straightforward, that it oftentimes you kind of circle back through different stages and different tasks, and we'll talk about that in a little while. And then the other thing is important to remember that everybody grieves in their own way. So in the next slide here, we have just some different types of grief. So I wanted to just kind of, and there are some others as well, but these are kind of the core types of grief that we often see for people who are coming into our office, and maybe even some that you yourself are dealing with. And we'll talk about a couple of these in particular a little bit more in depth in a little while, but two of those would be the complicated grief and the disenfranchised grief. But you have, normal grief, and I say that with kind of a caveat that, normal is different for everybody. And again, grief looks different for everybody. But typically, normal or normal or appropriate grief is something that, is pretty well managed. It would be expected that somebody would be reacting in the way that they were based on the loss. So it's pretty, straightforward grief. It's not very complicated. There's not a lot of, complications to it or different levels. Then you have anticipatory grief. So this is for folks who are anticipating the loss of somebody. We see this a lot in our clinic, especially for our hospice and palliative care families who may be struggling with their family members' decline, the anticipated loss of them. Complicated grief, again, we'll talk about in a little while, and some disenfranchised grief as well, because I anticipate that may be what some of you are kind of experiencing throughout this pandemic and related to the losses that you have been, experienced recently. Cumulative loss, that basically means that that there are multiple losses over a period of time. So they're kind of loss upon loss upon loss, which ends up making that grief very complicated. Chronic grief really lasts over an extended amount of time. So it's not something that ends up being resolved in a reasonable time, or at least addressed, or to a point where it's manageable, but it ends up lasting over a long period of time. And then there's also delayed grief. So that's when those initial reactions end up being postponed and experienced at a later time. So this is for folks who are kind of putting off those initial reactions and those responses to the loss that they're experiencing, maybe because of some need in their life, maybe because there's different things to be addressed, there's tasks to be done. A lot of family members or folks who I work with who are grieving have experienced this because they felt that there were a lot of other responsibilities immediately after the death for one reason or another that prevented them from being able to process through that grief in a timely manner. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how grief manifests. So grief, as I said earlier, really impacts us as humans, really on all different levels. And I think it's important to kind of understand each of these and the different reactions that are under each of these different subjects here. So first we have physical. So a lot of people who are experiencing grief kind of feel a lot of different physical symptoms, some of which may include things like numbness, being shaky or dizzy, either tightness in their throat or their chest, restlessness, exhaustion, headaches, body pains. A lot of folks who I work with come in and complain about just being physically drained. So those are some really common physical reactions. In terms of emotional, here's some of them who experience grief and loss include denial, remorse maybe, guilt, anxiety, resentment, anger, intolerance for others. One of the biggest things that I've heard over the years is people often feel emotionally drained as well, and they'll come in and say things like, I don't have the mental capacity to be able to deal with the things that I once dealt with, and they become just intolerant of certain situations or intolerant of certain emotions. So that's a significant impact on them. It also impacts our mental and cognitive functioning. So these are things like difficulty making decisions, inability to concentrate. You often hear kind of people talking about like a grief fog, that they feel like they're usually normally on top of everything and they just can't concentrate. They're just in this fog. Any sense of confusion. There's a fear of either feeling like you're losing your mind or going crazy. A lot of people who are experiencing these things feel like, gosh, I may be the only one who's experiencing this, and really struggle with that and feeling alone in that and feeling like, gosh, I feel like I'm going crazy or I feel like I'm losing my mind. And a lot of times it's just to normalize that and say that so many people who are grieving and who are experiencing loss of any kind really end up identifying with that. And another thing is just preoccupied thoughts. So again, going back to that difficulty of being able to concentrate. Some behavioral things that are common, things like avoidance, lethargy or exhaustion, loss of concern about personal appearance, irritability with others, impatience. Those are all very common things. Kind of tying into that in a more social way is that folks who are grieving or experiencing loss may either want other people around them more or may withdraw from other people or social activities that they normally or at one time were really invested in or that they really enjoyed. There's also a feeling of loss of warmth in relationships with others. So there may be this kind of this internal struggle to connect with others. And then finally, in a spiritual way, people who are grieving may feel a sense of anger towards a higher power, whatever that may be. They may be questioning their faith, questioning their spirituality, and it may prompt thoughts about their own mortality and their own death and really start to struggle with those things. So again, here's just kind of a list, although we covered it in the previous slide. Some most common grief responses are listed here. These are the ones that I feel like I hear the most of, and maybe the ones that that you all possibly are experiencing or have experienced at some point in your life, whether it's during the pandemic or at another time. Some of these may be very familiar. So there's a list there of common ones that I hear most often when working with folks. So traditionally, going back to kind of the founder of grief and loss research is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And initially, her 5 stages of grief were actually related to the process of a dying person. However, as time went on, they were kind of adapted to explain and to support the process we go through in grief. So initially, her thoughts were we would go through these 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, grieving, and acceptance. Then go to the next slide, Suzanne. So with that said, that's probably the most common thought that people have when they're grieving and when they're experiencing these reactions is that that it's linear, that there should be a process, that there should be a start and an end. And once you get through all of those steps, you should be done and you shouldn't have to experience anything anything more. And in actuality, over the years, as different researchers studied grief and the reactions that people were having, they adapted that to align more with a cyclical model of grief, which is what John Bowlby theorized, and that it's more of a cycle than a spiral, really, is that folks, yes, do move through different stages. And you'll see here in that graphic that the 4 stages that he identifies pretty closely relate to the stages that Kubler-Ross talked about. But really, as life goes on and as you continue to live your life, you start to incorporate that loss in different ways. So you start to adapt differently to it. You start to incorporate that into your life and be able to manage that better, and maintain those changes better. But at the same time, that never goes away. Grief and the loss of something never truly leaves, unfortunately. And so a lot of times what people feel is they feel like they've gotten to a point where they're functioning really well. There's really no concern. Maybe occasionally they'll have moments where they're, sad, or they remember the person that they've lost or the thing that they've lost. But overall, they're doing pretty well. But what ends up happening is that at certain times, and usually maybe there's another loss, or maybe there's a significant life change, or somebody who is really aware of the major holidays and milestones and remembering that person. A lot of times what's very common is that people end up circling back and being in maybe a prior stage that they thought that they had already been through. And that's very common in grief. And so I think a lot of times what's very helpful for people to understand is it's okay to feel that way again. If you're cycling back and feeling angry again, that's okay, and that's very normal, and that's to be expected. You may have to process through that in some way, whether that's through counseling, whether that's through just support of others, whether that's through just your own emotional recognition. That's totally okay, but it's really appropriate to do that kind of throughout your life, to be able to cycle back through those things depending on the life experiences that you're having. And then Bill Worden actually talked about the 4 tasks of grief. And similarly, again, to Kubler-Ross, he, instead of being really stages, he talked about tasks. So it kind of identifies a way of grieving where you don't necessarily have to go through, each stage and then you're done. This leads to more of a generalized approach to grief and being able to understand that people really do, throughout their grief process, tackle each one of these tasks. But they don't necessarily have to do it in a certain time frame or in a certain order. So as I said earlier, I think it's important for us to, or for me to really highlight 2 different types of grief, one being complicated grief. So complicated grief occurs when there's really multiple factors that are influencing that person's ability to grieve appropriately or normally. And there's a lot of different things that can impact this and can contribute to complicated grief. It can be complicated, and it can be considered complicated if that death or that experience of loss was sudden, was unexpected, maybe it was traumatic, which obviously now during this pandemic, we are experiencing a lot of those things resulting from an overly lengthy illness. So this could be somebody who had been sick for a very, very long time, and anticipating that death for a very long time. And there's a lot of complicated factors that go along with that, and or that the death that the mourner perceives as preventable. So a lot of times, and I think especially during this crisis, during this pandemic, I know I myself have felt that way, and I would imagine many of you have felt that way as well, that maybe there have been deaths that have been preventable. So if that is the case, that leads to a more complicated process for your grief. Some other factors that are important to consider too is if there is extreme anger or ambivalence about the death, if they're experiencing other concurrent crises or stressors. So not only are there deaths, but it's during a pandemic where, we're limited from contact with others and maybe don't have access to the resources we normally do. If there's any pre-existing mental health issues. So if you're someone maybe who already struggles with maybe anxiety or depression or some other type of mental health issue, that certainly complicates the process. If there's a perceived lack of social support, so that's very common right now, as I said, that a lot of us are limited to our homes and maybe aren't able to engage in the social network we once did, and so you're kind of feeling maybe a lack of support, and that certainly contributes to it. And then if you're experiencing disenfranchised grief, which we'll talk about in the next slide. So disenfranchised grief, you may or may not have heard this term before, but it most often occurs when a person who is grieving can't openly or doesn't feel like they can openly acknowledge the loss, or if they feel like society doesn't accept it as real, or if there's this taboo or standard that really society doesn't talk about it or accept it as a real type of loss. So this is when there is a loss, but the person who's experiencing that and experiencing that grief feels like they really don't have a right to grieve that. And the loss and or grieving process ends up being minimized. So, that may be true right now that, I think as healthcare workers, we are experiencing the secondary losses of this pandemic and hearing about these stories, and may feel very, very in tune and in touch with those losses and feel connected to them, but may feel like that grief that you're experiencing is minimized because maybe you weren't a family member of that person, or you didn't know them closely, but you can still feel for others, as humans, and as, other, friends, family, and other people who you've come in contact with. And there's also this need for the grief experience to be recognized and validated. So I think for those who are experiencing disenfranchised grief, one of the biggest things is to just be able to acknowledge that and validate that your feelings of loss and the reactions that you're experiencing and having, that's completely okay to feel that way, and to experience those things and to recognize those, even if there isn't that feeling that they can be processed or they can be expressed. So I wanted to be able to talk a little bit about the difference between grief and depression. So in the next slide, I gave you a graphic of what some differences between that, and wanted to kind of highlight or put into a visual representation of the fact that grief and depression are often very similar. And I wanted to put this in here because I think for a lot of us as healthcare professionals, and especially through this pandemic, we may be experiencing the need to kind of just continue to push forward. And although we're experiencing feelings of grief or the symptoms that are listed on this page, we may just feel like we need to push through and continue to do the work that we do every day, and to help the clients and the families that we work with. But it may get to a point where it's more than just grief, and it's more than just this feeling of loss and sadness, that it goes beyond that. So I think it's important to kind of be able to identify what is what. So you'll see under the grief column, there's things that we had talked about earlier. So things like sadness and crying, loss of appetite, numbness, that difficulty in concentrating. Some people may feel a sense of relief. This is more so, I think, in my experience, it has been with family members who have cared for their individual family member for a long period of time. And so after they die, there may be a sense of relief that is very normal to feel, because they may feel like, they're not suffering anymore, or, they can be at rest now. So there may be a feeling of that. and then sleep disturbance as well. So you'll see kind of all of these different grief reactions. On the other side, under depression, there may be more significant reactions. So maybe there's thoughts of suicide, feelings of hopelessness or worthlessness, inability to function, whether that's at school, whether that's at home, whether that's within your workplace, disruption in sleep, extreme loss of appetite or extreme loss of interest in activities. If you recall a few slides ago, we talked about this as a very common reaction to grief, and that people experience a loss of appetite, a loss of interest, and maybe engaging in social activities or doing things with others. And so that is very common, but in depression, it's a very extreme case and may last a lot longer. A lack of motivation, and then an inability to find pleasure in activities. So those are kind of the two on the outside column, but if you look in the middle where they overlap, there's a lot of things that are the same. So things like crying, sadness, tiredness, loss of appetite, numbness, difficulty functioning, rumination on things. So that anxiety of thinking of things over and over and over again, and kind of reprocessing those through your mind. So sometimes, because those are so similar, and because some of the symptoms that are experienced do overlap and have very, very similar responses in both, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. So on the next slide, there's kind of a breakdown of how you can tell, and how symptoms of grief typically manifest. So symptoms related to grief are usually ones that decrease in intensity over the days and weeks following the death. This may be impacted if experiencing complicated grief, as many of you may be experiencing or may experience in the future. But typically, there's that period of raw grief in the very beginning when that loss occurs. And there may be some intense emotions that are related to that during those days or weeks. But typically, if it's true grief, it tends to decrease over time. It often comes in waves as well, and it tends to be directly associated with thoughts or reminders of that loss. So, people often will say, I was good for a few days, and then all of a sudden it just came over me. And those are very common reactions to grief. Whereas in depression, it's going to last, it's going to continue. You're going to be kind of stuck in that and really struggle with being able to remove yourself from that feeling of kind of dread and hopelessness and worthlessness. There are in grief some positive emotions, and humor is present at times. So for a lot of folks who are experiencing loss, there is that ability to be able to reflect on and engage in humor, or be able to recall a funny instance or event. And so that is very common in grief, whereas in depression, it's very, very difficult to do that. So you're stuck in that place. It's very difficult to engage in something that's humorous with other people. And if the next one is self-esteem is generally preserved. So in grief, usually there's not a lot of self-deprecation. Your self-esteem is usually preserved in that. Whereas in depression, that self-esteem is jeopardized. So you may start to feel very either angry with yourself or have a lot of internal struggle and internal battle within your mind of who you are as a person, and maybe what you're capable of, or what you can do, what you can't do. And so it really jeopardizes that self-esteem. There's thoughts for grief, for people who are grieving. Thoughts of death are focused on the deceased, and many present as wanting to join them. So this may not be so much the case for some of you, but for family members or loved ones who have experienced the loss of somebody close to them, there's this sense of wanting to join them. And that doesn't necessarily mean ending their life. It's just that they miss them so much that they want to be with them. And one of the stories that I recall the most is a young girl that I was working with. Oftentimes children do this and will express this. most often. And one of the little girls I was working with had lost her grandmother, and her mother had heard her one night talking to her sister and saying, you know, I just wish I could die so that I could see grandma. And so she was very concerned about that. She came into the office and we were able to talk through that. And what we were able to identify was that she was just having difficulty comprehending how, you know, she missed her grandmother so much and had difficulty comprehending how she could see her. And the only way that she imagined that to happen was if she could die and build a bridge, she said, to heaven and be able to see her again. So a lot of people, you know, feel that way, and even adults I have heard say that to me, you know, that it's not that they necessarily want to die, but if they did, they knew they could see their loved one. So I think that that's an important distinction to make. Whereas people who are experiencing more severe depression may really end up, you know, having true thoughts of suicide or self-harm. So I wanted to also talk about some different styles of grieving. So they're really, while everyone, as I said earlier, really grieves in their own way, there are two kind of main styles of grieving. And two of these are the intuitive griever and the instrumental griever. So Terry Martin and Ken Doka researched this and published this as their book entitled Men Don't Cry, Women Do, Transcending Gender Stereotypes for Grief. So I want to say this kind of with caution, because I know that I don't want to overgeneralize or to put people in different categories and make it very black and white. But typically, what we'll see in women who grieve are much more intuitive grievers, and men are much more instrumental grievers. Now, again, that's very much overgeneralized, and although that often is the case, that is not always the case. And a lot of times people find themselves kind of somewhere in the middle, so they may be able to identify with both. So for an intuitive griever, they're really able to openly express their feelings. They're really comfortable in crying and seeking support from other people. They always allow for time to, for themselves to really experience the loss and to really take that in and internalize that and process through that. They may experience prolonged periods of confusion or difficulty concentrating. They're also, though, willing and able to talk about their grief. So for people who are aligned more with an intuitive griever, it may be very beneficial for them to access a support group of some kind, and they may really benefit from that. And if not a support group, maybe even individual counseling, somebody who would benefit from that. Because they're able to process through those things that they're feeling, they're able to talk about that and be able to be open with the reactions that they're having. Whereas the instrumental griever is often more of a person who tends to push aside those feelings of grief and loss as a way to cope. So they kind of just put on a strong face and push forward, and don't typically tend to acknowledge those feelings that may be there. They instead choose really active ways to express their grief. So this may be things like exercise or actually doing something. And I think that, again, not to overgeneralize, but a lot of men who I've seen over the years have said this, that they're often want to fix something, and they want to be able to do something very tangible in order to either help themselves or other people around them. Again, women could experience the same thing. They are also, instrumental grievers are also reluctant to express their feelings. And if they do, they are likely to do so really in a private environment. So maybe with just a close friend or family member, maybe even only to themselves. They also seek a lot of solitude to reflect and adapt to the loss. And they really are probably individuals, if they align more with that style of griever, probably would not do well in a support group. Maybe that they would benefit if they felt comfortable enough from individual counseling, but maybe just too overwhelming for them or too uncomfortable for them to be in a support group setting. So one of the last things I wanted to talk about today were some practical coping skills for all of you. And I hope that you're able to take these away and be able to maybe apply these if you haven't already. These are not only helpful considering, if you're experiencing reactions of grief and loss, but just during the pandemic and everything going on right now and the stress and anxiety of the state of things right now. These may be good things to incorporate into your daily routine or into a weekly routine. So first, just self-care. And being able to identify what works for you. It's different for everybody. Maybe that's just getting in the car and driving and listening to some music. Maybe it's just stepping outside for a few minutes to kind of take in some fresh breaths or some air. Maybe it's drawing, maybe it's some kind of creative work, just some type of self-care. It's important to also plan ahead for triggers. So a lot of folks will know that certain things will trigger different feelings of grief or loss, and they'll be able to prep for that and to plan ahead and understand how they're going to react if they're in contact with a situation that often or would likely have those triggers. It's important to give yourself space to identify those emotions. As I said before in the previous slide, for intuitive grievers, that may be more reasonable to think about that, to give yourself the opportunity to just really sit with those emotions and be able to identify them and feel them. And then to be able to express them in creative ways. So like I said, things like art or music or really tactile ways to be able to express that. Sometimes even physical exercise or physical movement is a very good way to be able to get out a lot of those thoughts or those feelings. To do something in memory or of honor of those who have died. So that may be, I've seen so many different people throughout this pandemic who are just wanting to do something to either honor someone who has died or a number of people who have died, or just to feel like they can give back, feeling hopeless and feeling as though they can't do anything. So maybe a good way to kind of combat that would be to do something in memory or honor of somebody. And for some people, that's been making masks or donating food or volunteering in some way. But you can find many different ways to do that, to honor that person or honor a group of people or feel like you're giving back in some way and able to have some sort of control over the situation. It's important also to utilize things like books and websites, some support groups, individual counseling, different supportive resources that are available to you to be able to, again, express those emotions and process through the experiences that you're feeling. And then to also seek support from friends and family. I know that it's difficult right now, but social networking, Zoom, different things we're lucky to have in a way to be able to connect with other people during this time. It's not the same as that personal connection and being able to see each other in person, but it's often important that we continue to have those social supports. Mindfulness and meditation, some of you may already participate in some of this, but I wanted to kind of highlight a few different apps that are really helpful that can be a good start for somebody who's considering maybe integrating this into their daily routine. One of those apps is called Calm. It's a very popular app right now. A lot of my clients use it, and I believe there is a free version, and they have a lot of different subsets. So they have, I think, something called sleep stories as well. So not only for mindfulness meditation to be able to give yourself a few minutes in the day to kind of stay grounded, but also at night if you're struggling to sleep, which again is a very common reaction to somebody who's suffering loss or anxiety, is that it's very difficult to sleep at night. It's very common that once you're in bed for the night, all those things that you've kind of pushed out of your mind for the day often come flooding back into your forefront of thought, and it's sometimes difficult to sleep. So one of those things may be to use an app for that, to kind of help focus that thought. Another app is called Headspace. This is a really great app. There's also a free version. And again, they have different modules that actually specifically relate to things like anxiety, grief, depression. They have very specific modules that talk about that and deal with that. And the last one is called Insight Timer. And this one is a very specific app that is really great, and I like it a lot because it really allows for people to really customize a mindfulness or a meditation session. It can be as short as a minute or two, or as long as 15 or 20 minutes. And oftentimes all you really need is a few minutes. So it's helpful to have that. And then, of course, any breathing techniques are very helpful. Again, some of you may already incorporate these into your life, but just taking a few deep breaths sometimes, really utilizing your diaphragm to be able to expand that and take in a deep breath. Sometimes that helps to ground. And then again, any physical kind of exercise is always a benefit. So just some final reminders, although these are some of the things that we talked about in the previous slide. It's just a gentle reminder to just take care of yourself. I think so many of us are feeling a pressure right now to perform and to fulfill our professional duties and to be on. And it's important to remember to take care of yourself. So basic things like, eating and getting rest as much as you can, crying it out if you need to with a trusted person or just by yourself, talking about it, allowing yourself to just experience the feelings that you may have and be okay with that and acknowledge that it's okay that you feel that way. And just remember that, grief and loss and that whole process, it takes time. And these are certainly unprecedented circumstances. And, just remember to be easy on yourself, be kind to yourself. You don't need any more pressure, certainly during this time. So these are just a couple resources I mentioned earlier that it might be helpful to just kind of educate yourself on what's out there. And these are two websites that we use quite often and that I recommend to folks. What'syourgrief.com is a wonderful resource. They have a ton of different information and sections about different types of loss, specific loss. And if you subscribe to their email, if you're interested in that, if you subscribe to them, they actually send out, usually a couple times a month, they'll send out a email with an article specifically related to some type of grief. And they're really a wealth of information and knowledge. The other is Dougie.org. So this is a wonderful, wonderful resource specifically for children and families. And it is, again, it has just an abundance of information, abundance of supportive, documents and books and different resources. It's a really, really wonderful resource. So I wanted to give you those two just in case you wanted to look up anything further or even recommend to other people who may be experiencing grief. And finally, as a wrap up, I want to give everybody the opportunity to ask any questions if they have any. But I wanted you to not forget about the Survey Monkey that we had sent out. I believe Suzanne sent it out a couple weeks ago, and we've already gathered some responses, but I wanted to remind you that it is there, and that is in relation to the support group that we'll be offering virtually to anybody who's interested in participating. So that link will be live through the end of this week. Through Friday. And so if you are interested or you would like to participate in a support group, CareFirst and our staff will be offering that to everybody free of charge. And it would be styled in a 6-week supportive session group. We would meet once a week virtually and be able to offer that space for people to come together and talk about the things that they're struggling with during this time. And I also wanted to remind everybody that if you're still feeling like you're really struggling with things and you really could benefit possibly from accessing some additional support, to reach out to your local mental health agency and or access your EAP program through your employer for services for that individual support. And if you needed anything or if you were struggling with this, please, either let Suzanne know who can let me know, and I would be happy to try to make those connections for other people as well. Sometimes local hospice agencies are also a really great resource and have different opportunities for folks to participate in some kind of community bereavement service. So just keep those things in mind. And at this point, I just want to open it up to anybody who has any questions.
Oh, thank you, Carly. That was really a great presentation. And we do already have some questions. And anybody who would like to ask questions, feel free to type it in the question box or raise your hand to be unmuted. So one question is from an individual who says that they've never experienced a mass death like New York has seen in the last 2 months. And she wants to know, is there a difference between experiencing a mass death and singular death loss? And sometimes these two things are going on at once.
Yeah. And I think that it is, I think there is a little bit of a difference, and kind of going back to talking about that complicated grief, the mass death certainly adds to a layer of that and certainly adds to the complicated nature of that process. And at the same time, as this person has identified, that those are often happening at the same time. So you yourself may be experiencing loss of an individual, loss of a singular person, but also experiencing more on a global level, the mass loss. And so, yeah, those things can be happening all at once. And I think it's very, very telling of how much that's impacting the process that people are experiencing and grieving and limiting, I guess, the ability for somebody to do that effectively, really. It just adds so many different layers of complication to it. And I anticipate that, that will be there for quite a while as we move forward as kind of mental health professionals. I think that we'll see kind of the ripple effects of that over the next months, possibly even years, especially for healthcare workers and people who have been on the front lines or have been impacted by the mass loss, that will be something we'll deal with for quite a while.
Thank you. And we have Carolyn. I'm going to try and unmute you. It doesn't seem to be working. All right. Well, she also typed her question. So she asked if you could talk about the 4 tasks again. Maybe I can scroll.
Sure. Yeah. Is there something specific that I can revisit?
It just says, can you please list the 4 tasks again? Oops, did I just go by it?
Yeah. Yeah. So that first task is really accepting the acceptance of the reality of the loss. So it may take quite a while for somebody to experience this or to kind of process through this and to get through that first task. A lot of people, as you know, and kind of referring back to Kubler-Ross, that idea of denial. So people for a period of time really have a hard time even believing that that's reality. A lot of people will tell me, I pick up the phone to call a family member or a friend because it was something part of my everyday routine, and I go to pick up the phone and I know they're not there, right? So, or they're walking down the street and they think that they see that person. It's just hard for them to be able to grasp the reality of that loss. So as with Kubler-Ross, it was more of a stage, right, that you got through it, where that task for Bill Warden is really more so of, like I said, a task. It doesn't really have a definitive timeline on it. And this may end up happening throughout the course of that grieving process. I think that's important to notice, I guess, about this kind of style or theory of grief, is that these tasks, while they are things that typically people experience and go through, they don't necessarily happen all in the same order, and they don't all have to happen individually, that a lot of these things often take place simultaneously. So as you're trying to process the pain of the grief, which is the next task, you may also be continuing to try to accept the reality of that loss. And that third task is to adjust in a world without the deceased. So these are things like, maintaining those continuing bonds with that person, honoring, memorializing them, finding ways to continue to pull that person, put that person with you throughout your journey forward, and adjust to a life without them. And then that fourth task is to find, again, an enduring connection with the deceased in the midst of embarking on a new life. So this is acknowledging the fact that you are moving forward. You never truly get over a loss. I think a lot of people who I've talked with over the years have this internal struggle because they feel like there's this pressure to just get over it or to move on. And I always say it's not about moving on, it's about moving forward, because moving on kind of promotes this idea that, that was then and I'm over it now, and now I'm here and I don't have to worry about it again, or I don't have to deal with that again. And that's not the case. And I don't think for anybody who loses somebody, they would want that. You want to have that continuing bond with that person in some way. So maybe that's during a special holiday or event, finding ways to incorporate the memory of that person, incorporating them into your life as you go on. Maybe it's writing them letters, or, writing them birthday cards, or doing something memory of them, but to continue to remember them as you go on throughout your journey in life. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, I got a response back that was exactly what they were looking for.
Okay, good.
So I will say personally that I really resonated with that concept of disenfranchised grief. I think that a lot of us, or myself in particular, feel like, I'm not the right person to be grieving, that
Sure.
I'm not a family member, but certainly I have feelings about so many of the people that we're working closely with and losing. And I also think there's a strong feeling of guilt that goes along with that, because our job is so focused on helping people leave nursing homes. When we have people who have died before we can get them out of the nursing home, there's a feeling of, what could we have done differently? Couldn't we have done something else? And, if we had been able to get them out, would they still be alive? And those are some of the very strong feelings that I'm feeling lately.
Yeah. And I'm glad that you can identify that, Suzanne. And I think that, even myself, I've identified that for myself as, I've heard different stories, or I've, seen, a lot of our hospice family members who are able to visit their families at the end of their life, or, feeling guilty for not being able to do more for other people during this time. And especially for you and your staff and everybody who's on the call today, of feeling like there maybe could have been something you could have done, maybe something more. I think there's always going to be that feeling there, and partly because of the work that we do every day and wanting to help others. I think that's kind of innate in us, but it definitely does add to that, again, that complicated grief and that idea of disenfranchised grief, of that feeling like you don't have the right to grieve that, when in actuality you certainly do. It's just the fact that it's not widely recognized, at least at this point. I think it will continue to be, and I hope that it will be in the future as we kind of get through this pandemic and everything that's going on. But right now, I have heard a lot of people, a lot of healthcare professionals, recognize that and be able to align with that feeling of just not feeling like they're able to process that, or maybe they don't have the right to.
Yes, well, thank you very, very much. If I don't see any other hands raised or questions in the box,
Okay.
but we do appreciate it. And just so everyone knows, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording as well as the PowerPoint will be available on the NILE website. And again, thank you very, very much, Carly. This was so timely for us.
You're welcome. I hope that everybody, my thoughts are with everybody, and if there's anything else I can do to help, I'm more than happy to.
And just a quick reminder, if you did want to join the virtual support group, please click the SurveyMonkey link. If you don't have that, shoot me an email and I'll send it again to you. Or if you don't want to type in all those, I'd be happy to send it to you again as a link. Thank you again, Carly.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.